if you look at the term capital, capital has different meanings, but the primary meaning that we're talking about is the production of something not for consumption, but to allow further production. So instead of, going back to hunter-gatherer days, instead of me spending my time pulling up roots and finding the roots to eat, I take my time and I sharpen a stick and I use that stick to dig up roots. So the first capital was the first stone tool or first wood tool. So capital has existed since before recorded human history, right? And we use capital to give us a better ability to meet our needs. A person with a stick can dig up roots faster than a person with their hands. And so that is the reality of our world. Most of the surplus value that's created is created because we have added capital to that. And eventually capital reached the point with generated energy to where we had industrialism. But so you can't wish away capital. Capital is going to exist. You can, as you say, look at different ownership relations. But at the end of the day, the ownership relations that have produced by far the most wealth are letting the person that made that stick keep using that stick themselves.
But my argument isn't that capital exists. My argument is who owns the capital.
Yeah, absolutely right.
So therefore, it should be owned collectively by the people, not just by a small few, because then that small few aren't actually doing the work and being able to produce. They're also extracting the surplus labor from the people. That being said, then therefore that is exploitative. Us having capital, meaning collectively owning the capital, I'm not against that. In fact, I'm actually all for that. So good to have you finally on the channel, and nice to have this discussion with you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Mr. Ashby, one of the things that I would like to begin with is what sparked this conversation. This conversation is something that I think that many people have been having online and many different podcasts and things like that. So I just want to go into what the birthplace of this is. And so then we can set more of like context and ground to show people exactly why we're having this conversation. So I'm going to be sharing this on X. And this was a tweet from you responding to me. And in my response, in my initial statements, I was actually quote tweeting from a tweet that talks, that was the discussion about Zohran Mamdani. It says, in an exclusive sit-down visit, says not the right time for Osechi to challenge Representative Jeffries. And so I actually said that, what did I say? Where are the left organizations in New York City? If you don't hold his feet to the fire before he's sworn in, then y'all are going to look like a joke, prove us wrong. Then Mr. Ashby responded and says the problem is that the far left convinced themselves that Mamdani was something other than what he was, which is a pragmatist. When he said the middle of the road things during the campaign, a few talked themselves into believing he was just moderating his language to get elected. And then I also said that I wrote my article about not trusting Zohran Mamdani. And then you said that I should have you on my show. You said you're a red state Democrat and a minor party leader from all places, Ferguson, Missouri. I think we have a lively conversation. And so because of this, then now you are here.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Welcome. So just the question is, in what way did you mean that many of us were, do you feel like we were attributing more to Zohran Mamdani than that we thought he was letting on?
Yeah, and so it's a tough thing, right? And almost the starting point has to be, what is the definition of socialism? And, people in my generation, I got lots of gray hair, right? We have kind of a binary definition of that that's, literally goes back 100 years. And so we have viewed socialism as state socialism, the Soviet Union. And it's worth noting that a younger generation actually has a more technical definition of socialism. If socialism technically is ownership or is a state control of the means of production, right? We typically think of factories and farms and things like that, but young people point out that roads are part of the means of production and education is part of the means of production. And so it's not a binary. It's not either capitalism or socialism, more accurately, it's a blend of private responsibilities and public responsibilities. And we do need to do a better job of understanding those public responsibilities. So for Mamdani, he was running to be mayor of New York. He was not running for president, not running for autocrat. He was running for a very specific purpose with a very specific role and a very specific set of possibilities. He has no ability to socialize anything. He does have the ability to move the line between public responsibility and private responsibility, and hopefully do a better job on the public responsibility. So my point was that people on the left have this grand vision of revolution, when really he was somebody in the middle in a very constrained position who was trying to make things a little bit better within the parameters of what he was allowed as mayor of New York.
Thank you very much for that clarification. So, and I'm glad that you didn't generalize everybody on the left. One of the things that I think is important is that you have some that may be overtly idealist in their thinking in response to people like Zohran Mamdani. These tend to be more of, from what it seems like to me, the social democrats, the people who think that somebody within the Democratic Party can actually reform anything. I am not one of those people. I am a communist, and so therefore I do not believe that any type of reform can come through the Democratic Party at all. My critiques of people like Zohran Mamdani is that, yes, he's running within the system, but at the same time, I also I reserve a lot of hesitancy when it comes to people like him, because he's running within the system that really will not necessitate any real change for the working class people. It's really just managing the chaos. And so for somebody like myself, when I look at somebody like him, I don't trust him because I don't trust either party.
Well, you don't trust the system, right?
I don't trust either party. I don't trust the system.
Yeah.
I don't trust the economic system that we're under. I see that it has not done us any good, at least within the last 40 years or within my lifetime.
Yeah.
I think it had this apex really up into the 60s. And then once it reaches apex, then it was a downward from there. And I think it's time for a new economic system that benefits the workers beyond capitalism.
Yeah, and fair points. Hey, just a little bit of definitional housekeeping. When you say communist, what do you mean by that?
I believe that the workers, the proletariat, the people should collectively own all centers of what is considered to be public good within things like education, healthcare, housing, when it comes to protecting ourselves, protecting the environment. And so I believe that socialism is the vehicle towards that, but it is not the end all be all. And so socialism.
What separates socialism from communism?
Socialism is the vehicle to get there versus communism is the destination. It's just like your car is not California, but your car is the vehicle that you use to get to California if you're driving, right?
But what differentiates the two? I understand that one is, and Karl Marx said the same thing, right? That it was a progression from capitalism to socialism to communism. Mm-hmm. But he had a very specific list of things that differentiated socialism from communism. What are your differentiators?
My differentiations are that the workers will finally get to a point where the productive forces are determined not necessarily by capital and earning, but I would like to get back to essentially what the indigenous had, was I think called more like a gift economy, and so not having influence of money and politics, not having influence of finance in order to be able to achieve, having a decent standard of living. Yeah. I feel like pretty much everything that we receive from this planet is free. We just have to work together in order to be able to achieve it collectively, instead of it being achieved through a small group of people owning everything, and then we are actually enriching the small group of people at the top.
No, that's a fairly good definition, actually. So if you go back to Marx, right, he thought that socialism would follow capitalism, but because of the period of capitalism, the workers, the people, they still had the habits of capitalism. They still had the habits of fear of need, and they still had the habits of greed. And so a period of socialism would be necessary to deal with those habits. But eventually the habits of capitalism would fade away, and we would get back to that more communalistic state that you just mentioned, right? And so really the differentiator between socialism and communism is that under socialism, you still need a coercive state to make sure that people contribute their labor and don't take too much. At some point, because people have lost those bad habits of capitalism, the state can wither away and you have communism. So you have people doing good, doing their part, to each his ability, to each his needs, down the road. But so the challenge of what you just talked about is, and I've actually written a book, Capitalism and Socialism, the Democratic Party. I'm in the process of looking for a publisher. There are these fantasies about socialism that do not stand economic scrutiny. And that really is the biggest challenge, is that there is this assumption that there is something other than capitalism. But really what we're talking about is industrialism. And the ownership relationship is a small part of that overall picture. And so I had actually written something, I don't know if I sent it to you or not, but years ago in the 1930s, there was kind of a battle between socialism on the one side and unregulated capitalism on the other side. And we picked a middle path. We picked moderated capitalism. We stuck with the free market, but we used the power of democracy to make sure that everybody had a chance to participate, had a chance to benefit, and played by the same set of rules. Okay. And we lived by that until, as you note, 1970s. With the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a rise of triumphant capitalism and the idea that we could undo the regulatory state. And that's when things started getting bad. And to borrow a line from Hemingway, it happened two ways: gradually, then suddenly. So we had 40 years of gradually, and now we have the suddenly. So you're right that people your generation have never experienced moderated capitalism, but that doesn't make socialism any more viable of an opportunity or of an option, in my opinion.
Okay. Well, from what it sounds like, you're trying to get to more what you would consider to be more social democracy, correct?
It's the people get caught up in the definitions, but that is certainly an adequate definition, right? It would be, if you talk to people in Scandinavia, they never say they're socialist countries. They say they're social democracies, okay. Free market with a safety net, regulatory free market. So yes, that's as good a term as any.
Okay. So my issue with going towards a social democracy is that what the problem with social democracies, especially within the ones in Europe, is that they were able to achieve what they were able to achieve not by just their own, by their own volition, but they were able to achieve it through really exploiting the global South in order to be able to have the achievements that they have. You can look at, like, for instance, what happens in places like Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, where, the gold reserves in Mali were financing France. You have Niger that has the uranium that powers the nuclear reactors in France. And yet, places like Niger, their amount of electricity is wholly inadequate. And so imperialism has honestly have ravaged the global South to the point where they are unable to bring themselves up, even though they're the ones with the resources. And so it's like what Michael Parenti said. He said there's no such thing as a poor country. They're just overly exploited. And so unfortunately, even if you have reins on capitalism will just shake those reins off eventually, just like what they did with the New Deal. The New Deal was really just a way to put guardrails on capitalism. And because of those guardrails that were placed there, then those guardrails were eventually taken away because the capitalistic forces were able to influence our political officials into peeling back whatever gains that we have. And so now we're at the point where we are actually coming up into a worse position than even we were during the Great Depression. I mean, look at the housing and the cost of living crisis that we're in right now. In the real economy, people are really suffering now, despite whatever the stock market says.
Yeah, no, all fair points, right? And to your point, capital will always push back against the guardrails.
Mm-hmm.
And people in my generation, right? I'm 61 years old. What in your generation that messed it up? I'm guessing, but 30s? How old are you?
I'm 41.
Okay. I was going to say 30s, early 40s, right? So you weren't alive when the bad stuff. It's on my generation, right? Because as you say, we had the guardrails in place. Capital pushed back. Instead of protecting the guardrails, part of the Democratic Party bought into triumphant capitalism. They bought into the idea that because we had matured, we no longer needed government protections. We no longer needed a government to make sure that everybody had a chance to participate.
Mm-hmm.
But so, in my opinion, the answer is we need to get back to those guardrails because there is no other alternative. And that really is the key. As long as we think that this, no disrespect, right, but this fantasy of socialism is possible, we won't focus on fixing capitalism. We'll think there's something else. And in a way, it gives young people a chance to sit idly by and say, oh, well, not my responsibility. I'm going to wait for it to collapse and not try and fix it. We need young people to engage with fixing the system we have and not pretend that they can wait for this to collapse and the next one will be better.
My question to you then, okay, so let's say hypothetically we get to that point back to where we have the guardrails. What is next?
Got to maintain it, right? Government is it's not a destination, it's a process. And the challenge over and over again, as you say, right, capital will always push back against restraints. That's the nature of capital. Once we get back to those guardrails, we have to make sure we maintain those guardrails. And that is not necessarily an easy thing to do. But that really has to be the goal. And I can explain to you why socialism won't work, but it's a tedious conversation, right? But if you look at, there are different ways of slicing and dicing socialism. One of the ways you can look at it there are three kinds. There is systemic socialism, where the whole system is socialist. There's sector socialism, where, for instance, just the steel industry is socialist, and then there is enterprise socialism. All of those approaches have been tried. They have all failed miserably. And they didn't fail because the United States was, pushing back against the Soviet Union. They failed because if you look at the writings of Karl Marx, they do not stand scrutiny. Karl Marx spent a lot more time talking about capitalism than he did socialism. If you take his science, and this is one of our challenges, right, is that every philosopher has a little bit of science and a little bit of religion. With most, we toss out the religion and keep the science. With Marx, we tossed out the science and we kept the religion. But the science of Marx says that those three versions of socialism will not be able to match the productive output of the private market of capitalism. So there's a mouthful.
So let me ask this. What further? So my question being, if it hasn't worked, then why do we have some countries that are socialist, that despite whatever the United States is doing, they still exist today? But the only reason why they are struggling is because of the sanctions, embargoes, and fight that the United States and the collective West put up against it. And they still managed to survive despite it.
But see, I'm not sure, so China didn't move away from socialism because of military threats from the United States. They moved away from socialism because socialism wasn't producing the value, the wealth that the economy needed. And other than Cuba, what in your opinion, what is the most socialist country? Maybe Venezuela, but what is the most socialist country left in the world?
Probably DPRK, North Korea.
North Korea, okay. North Korea is a miserable place. People hate it. It has no personal freedoms. And we actually don't know how bad things are because they won't let us in. When people manage to escape, they say that prosperity is actually a fraud. And, literally they have people buy goods. When the cameras come, they have people buy goods and then take them around back and bring them back so they've got more goods to sell. North Korea is a terrible example of a socialist country, in my opinion. So what would be a different example that's not quite so repressive?
North Korea is a terrible example. Okay.
Well, would you like to live in North Korea?
I think it'd be cool.
Yeah. The people that are in North Korea are doing their best to get out uniformly.
No, actually, no. They actually get out by the thousands, the hundreds of thousands. The problem is that they can't come here to the West because of the sanctions that they have in place, they won't allow them to be able to use their visas, not visas, but their passports to be able to come here. So a lot of times they do travel. They go to places like China actually quite a bit. So they're actually able to travel in and out of the country. The problem is that the United States put so many sanctions and blockades on places like North Korea that they really can't even come here.
I agree, would make it harder for North Koreans to come here, but I think you're overestimating just how much freedom of movement North Koreans have. So you're saying hundreds of thousands go on vacations to Europe. They go on vacations to Saudi Arabia. You're saying right now people can come and go at will in North Korea.
Yeah.
All right. I don't think that matches up with the most people's understanding of how the country operates.
Most people, who's most people?
Anybody from the government of North Korea. Has the government of North Korea said that people are free to leave if they want?
Yeah, they allow them to go.
Yeah.
The problem is that really, because the thing is, you're I think a lot of people, they trust what the West says about a certain place versus instead of actually going and getting primary sources from other places outside of the West. And a lot of times we end up listening to them and we trust what the West says. And if the West has lied to us about Iran, they lied to us about Nicaragua, they lied to us about Cuba, they lied to us about Chile, what makes you think that they're not lying about places like DPRK or Cuba or Venezuela or even Russia? I mean, my thing is it's like if I have a partner and they keep serial cheating on me, and then next thing you know, they're like, oh man, even though I was naked with that person, it didn't really mean anything, and it's not what it looks like. It's like, do I look like Boo Boo the Fool? It doesn't make sense.
But let's take those in order, right? So Chile, right? So 1973, was it the Allende government? In 1973, the CIA helped overthrow a democratically elected socialist leaning government, right?
Yeah.
That was 50 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that time, what has the United States done that has kept them from leading their own lives?
I mean, the United States has done regime change after regime change and actually put in their own puppets. Look what they tried to do in Venezuela. They tried to put in Maria Corina Machado in order to be able to take over the Venezuelan government in order to make sure that Maduro doesn't become president again. So, I mean, the United States does this all the time.
I understand. In Chile, what else? What have they done in Chile? I understand. With there 188 countries in the world, something like that. In Chile, what have they done that has kept that country from deciding its own path?
The CIA is a thing. I mean, the United States does intervene in all these countries in order to make sure that they don't. And on top of that, if they don't, if they're able to achieve anything, you have sanctions and blockades and all these different things that also prevent these countries from actually moving forward as well. So,
but even
it's not just a one-off. It's basically these countries are trying, but the problem is that in order to be able to compete on the world stage, I mean, we literally have, the dollar is the reserve currency of the world. So they kind of have to play ball, but at the same time, even when they're trying not to, the United States punishes them for trying to go into a different direction.
Yes and no, and sometimes I'm not disagreeing. But going back to the Soviet Union didn't fail because the United States would not sell it high-end military electronics. The Soviet Union failed because its model could not produce the wealth to keep its people satisfied. It really was a revolution in the Soviet Union. The people that had actually lived through state socialism found it to be lacking in one of the different systems. And that has happened over and over again. The countries that have actually tried full-bore socialism, the people, not the United States, the people in the country have found them to be lacking, and they have moved away from that system. Even Great Britain moved away from nationalization of steel. The Scandinavian countries, they privatized the few things that the government did own. Over and over again, we come back to private ownership is the model, private ownership with moderation. And I recognize what you're saying about predatory capitalism, but moderated capitalism is the model that virtually every country has moved toward.
And yet we still have the issues that we have now.
Oh yeah, no, and so part of this, and you're right. You mentioned imperialism, right? So part of this is that we've got a philosophic belief in a system of government, and in the equality of human beings, right? In theory, our country was based on this idea of the equality of human beings. In actual practice, it's been a slowly expanding circle of freedom, and there are many people who were not included in that circle, especially early on, less so now, but even still. And so same thing, one of the challenges with the global South is that we essentially put in place colonial capitalism. We did not give them the ability to govern their country. And the one thing we didn't export was liberalism and the belief in the individual. And so a lot of these countries, they've got the worst of it. They've got a colonial capitalist system without a belief in individual freedom. And that means they tend to default to government by groups, and government by groups has historically wound up being oppressive of the outgroups.
So what's the difference between colonial capitalism and capitalism?
So colonial capitalism is, as you say, right, it's extractive. So it was a model put on top of existing, a lot of these societies weren't feudal, right, but they weren't industrial. It was a model put on non-industrial societies for the purpose of extracting resources that would have benefited industrialism. So as you say, we took over countries to get access to cobalt or to oil or to, I was going to say one more, but diamonds, for example, right? So that is colonial capitalism, absolutely. It is a dash of imperialism because we are not there to spread the word about individual freedom. We're there to extract resources to benefit industrialism.
But isn't that just capitalism? I mean, capitalism is about who owns what, not necessarily. So by that being said, if the owners of the means of production, which is a very small group, are dictating to the government that we should go over there and take their resources, wouldn't that still just be regular plain old capitalism? It's just like if I take a potato and if I make it into potatoes au gratin or russet potatoes or any other type of potatoes, it's still potatoes at the end of the day, right? Yeah. So why are we trying to say, oh, this type of capitalism is good, but that type of capitalism is good? If I put just a little drop of poison in a cup of water, and then I say, oh, it just has a little drop of poison, it's not a full cup of poison, is it still poison water or not?
Okay, but so the challenge, though, is that we're talking about industrialism, right? So if you look at the term capital, capital has different meanings, but the primary meaning that we're talking about is the production of something not for consumption, but to allow further production. So instead of, going back to hunter-gatherer days, instead of me spending my time pulling up roots and finding the roots to eat, I take my time and I sharpen a stick and I use that stick to dig up roots. So the first capital was the first stone tool or first wood tool. So capital has existed since before recorded human history, right? And we use capital to give us a better ability to meet our needs. A person with a stick can dig up roots faster than a person with their hands. And so that is the reality of our world. Most of the surplus value that's created is created because we have added capital to that. And eventually capital reached the point with generated energy to where we had industrialism. But so you can't wish away capital. Capital is going to exist. You can, as you say, look at different ownership relations. But at the end of the day, the ownership relations that have produced by far the most wealth are letting the person that made that stick keep using that stick themselves.
But my argument isn't that capital exists. My argument is who owns the capital.
Yeah, absolutely, right.
So therefore, it should be owned collectively by the people, not just by a small few, because then that small few aren't actually doing the work and being able to produce. They're also extracting the surplus labor from the people. That being said, then therefore that is exploitative. Us having capital, meaning collectively owning the capital, I'm not against that. In fact, I'm actually all for that. But the thing is that it has to be done in a democratic and collectivist fashion, or for it to be able to be utilized by the entire people as a whole, because that's how society works.
Yeah.
So,
but you keyed on something there, right? Because ownership of the means of production, but there's also control of the means of production. And so one of the reasons that socialism failed is it created this illusion that if we take away ownership of the means of production, we take away the benefits of ownership. But the benefit also accrues to control. And so in Soviet factories, and and Marx, the term Marx used was scientific socialism. He thought that we could scientifically manage the economy, take out the personal bias, take out the personal greed, but manage the economy for the good of all. But even without ownership, the people in the Soviet Union still had a benefit of controlling the means of production. And because of that, there was still a competition to control the means of production, even if the ownership was this watery state, right? And so that's my point, is that if you look back to Marx and what he wrote, you can pretend that you can take away greed and that you can take away self-interest, but because management of capital is a specialization, just like anything else, benefit will always accrue to the management of capital, regardless of the ownership structure. So with that as a reality, it's easier to just say, okay, well, people can not only control it, they can own it. If they do a good job, they get to control more. If they do a bad job, they lose control of it. So the problem isn't that people own things. The problem is that we've made it very hard for them to lose those things if they do a bad job of owning them.
it sounds like you're speaking about it and thinking that it's an anti-democratic thing, when in reality, the type of socialism we talk about is socially owning the means of production and basically democratically deciding on how it gets used. So therefore, if it's democratic in how it's being used, therefore it is the people speaking for how something is used, how the capital is being used. So therefore, like for instance, if we democratically decide, okay, we're going to build roads and bridges in this area, and if the collective decides on that, then of course, then yeah, it is by majority rule. And so therefore, it's basically what the people want.
Okay, but
so,
you picked the easiest example, and even that one's hard, by the way. There's all sorts of controversy on where to build roads, but look at so a couple things first, right? So the labor theory of value is incorrect. The labor theory of value ascribes all of the surplus value created to the labor, when the economic reality is that in most cases, most of that surplus value can be ascribed to the capital. And because Marx refused to acknowledge the value of capital, there is no mechanism in socialism for the deployment of capital. So let me give you an example, right? This is a real world example, right? Here in St. Louis, there was something called the Black Bear Bakery. Bread is life. And a bunch of socialists, a bunch of delightful human beings. It was like 15 of them when they started. And they all got together and they started a collective, and they started a bakery. That bakery made it about 12 years before it shut down. And what happened was, it's easy to say all 15 of us should decide how to run the bakery. But at the end of the day, somebody has to be there at 7 o'clock on a Sunday morning. How do you schedule that? What happens if you schedule somebody and they don't show up? Are they kicked out of the collective? What happens if one person has a personal bias for sweets and another person has a personal bias for rye bread? How do you decide what to produce? Right? And there was no easy answer for Black Bear Bakery, because going back to Marx, there are only two possible relations to consumption. There is produce and consume, which is way back. It used to be that almost everything we consumed, we produced. But now, because of industrialism, we have an exchange economy. So there is produce and exchange. We virtually produce none of what we produce. If I work at a bakery, I might buy a loaf of bread a week, right? But there are 10,000 loaves of bread I didn't buy. If I work at an auto plant, I might buy one new car every 3 years, but there are 100,000 cars that I didn't buy. And so it gets back to who defines value. And in the economic system, the person that defines value is the person that uses it. So it didn't actually matter what the employees of Black Bear Bakery wanted to produce. What mattered most was what the customers of Black Bear Bakery wanted to buy. And so it failed because they assumed that we could collectively get together and decide how to run the business for our own interests. Businesses do not run for the interests of the employees. Businesses create surplus value by selling things to other people. And in our industrial world, nothing's going to change that relationship. The people at Black Bear, the 15 people, were not qualified to run Black Bear. Black Bear went out of business. And that's what's going to happen and that's happened in virtually every socialist enterprise.
I just would have got all 15 people together and said, okay, let's start asking the customers what they want. And then we collectively decide to do what the customers want.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. You can take surveys, but how do you...
But then it still would have been collective.
No, because think about how that works in the real world, right? Think about that, right? You've been to a bakery, obviously, right? And you walk in, they've got breads, they've got sweets, they've got rolls, they've got drinks, they've got lots of different things.
Okay.
Right. So, and a bakery might have 300 customers a day. So how many customers you talk to figure out what people want to buy? So I wrote this book and I actually addressed this scenario specifically, right? Because there's this idea that, we can just poll the people and see what they want the next day. But you can't, because maybe somebody, in a bakery, they bake in the morning for what you eat in the late morning and early afternoon, right? So you think, let's let the consumers democratically say what they want. Well, what if I say I want chocolate cookies and I get home and my wife brought home chocolate cookies from work? I don't want chocolate cookies anymore. I mean, that's the thing, right? It's easy to say there are these mechanisms for, and virtually every economic decision is a prediction of the future, right? I drink a Coke because I think it's going to satisfy my thirst. I bake bread now because I think I can sell it in the future. So economic decisions are predictions of the future. Predicting the future is notoriously hard, even for qualified people. Mm-hmm. So it's easy to say we'll have this democratic socialist approach. It doesn't work. It just flat out doesn't work. And if you try and run the traps on it, it becomes pretty obvious pretty quickly. So here's a good example. A power plant takes about $3 billion to build. Mm-hmm. Right? How do you, go ahead. No, go ahead.
So you don't agree with worker cooperatives either?
No, so the cooperatives that have worked in the United States have been buying cooperatives and selling cooperatives. The idea that you can run a business end to end, that has not tended to work. There's a company called HEB, I think it's HEB, maybe Publix. One of the grocery store chains in the South has a strong dose of worker ownership. But it's still managed by professionals, and there's a subset of stock that decides who gets to manage it. So
so that's not really a worker cooperative. Publix is an employee stock ownership program, so at SEOP, and so therefore those stores are actually managed, or they're not managed democratically. They are actually governed by a small group of people, but the employees have a small stock ownership. But in regards to how the store and the company is actually ran, is not democratic at all. So I am the type of person where I love democracy so much that I actually want it in the workplace as well. And so I would go beyond a employee stock ownership program, and I would have workers actually democratically vote on how things are ran. And additionally to that is we're talking about things like certain goods and services, but what I really want is really collective ownership of the more essential services, whether they be in energy, in education, and things like energy, education, healthcare, things like that. And so,
absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. Again, we started off talking, it's not a binary, it's a scale. And as you say, there are some things that are critical to the public good, and they should have public control. We should have public schools. We should have public roads. There's a school of thought called utility socialism. Once again, we've backed away from it. But at one point, we had regulated monopolies providing electrical service. That was the model you're talking about. It did work for us at one point. The problem isn't that model. The problem is that we backed away from that model. And we started, even with the energy, we started privatizing it and moved away from that central idea that it's a public good and it needs to be managed for the public.
Yeah. So I think there is a little bit of overlap between us. I just think that I disagree on some nuances of what we're talking about. But I also feel like somebody like a Zohran Mamdani, um, I I personally am under no impression that somebody like him would be anything beyond what some people assumed he would be. I think that he'll probably be more like a Blasio-esque type of mayor. Um, and I get completely why people voted for him. They wanted, they didn't want their rent to go up, which, I wouldn't want to either. Um, I see how a city owned, a municipally owned grocery store would definitely help. And
It's got to
I
change.
agree.
I agree.
And so for me, somebody, and I'm in Florida, right? My voice really doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. I'm just an outsider looking in. But when I look at somebody like a Zohran Mamdani, I say, you guys didn't really have any choices outside of duopoly, so I can't fault the people for that. And when I look at somebody like a Zohran Mamdani, it's like, okay, you're going to govern in this fashion, but this means that, and this is why I directed my attention to the left groups in New York City. It's, are you going to be holding his feet to the fire if he deviates from anything that he said he ran on? And so I think the issue is that some people who consider themselves to be on the left lull themselves to sleep because they think, the job is done once the person is elected, when in reality, the job just started.
Yeah. But then also there's what is the job, right? And the job for him is to run New York City in an efficient manner that gives people, more access to things, more affordability. I want to circle back to something real quick, because I think this is the key. And you'd said this earlier. There are people that suggest that capitalism is inherently exploitative. John Stewart said that. It drives me crazy. That's not actually true. Capitalism is not inherently exploitative. It certainly can be exploitative. But that idea goes back to the labor theory of value, and the labor theory of value is wrong. I mean, grocery stores are a good example. The typical grocery store has a profit margin of 1.5% to 2%. If you say, we should make that, we should socialize that, well, that just means you've reduced prices by 1.5% to 2%. It doesn't really mean you've made that big of a dent. But so if capitalism is not inherently exploitative, then it can be fixed. And that's my point, is that, not just to pick on you, right? But people on the left say these things about capitalism that are provably wrong, and then use that as a way of attacking capitalism and saying we must go to socialism. Whereas if we actually look at capitalism, it can be exploitative, but it's not inherently exploitative. I mean, capitalism is neither moral or immoral, it's amoral. It's how you implement it. And just to take it a step further, right? A typical business makes about a 4% profit. So you can say, they're exploiting the workers, but that's 4%. It's not that much of the pie. And the person that's getting that 4% is managing that business, had to put their own capital at risk, had to put their family life on hold. I mean, so, at least by the numbers, capitalism isn't that exploitative of workers. And assuming you believe that or accept that the labor theory of value is wrong, the people that put in the money deserve a little bit of money for it. I mean, there's no reason that somebody who funded the cost of opening a coffee shop shouldn't get a little bit of return on their capital.
I feel like capitalism is inherently exploitative. Some of the first tools of capital that were utilized in the United States were my ancestors. And so therefore, I do not have any type of love for capitalism whatsoever. And so the owning of the means of production, i.e. my ancestors that we've had in this country, it is inherently exploitative. And look at what they do when it comes to the environment, right? They will shift things in order to be able to earn, that's a funny word, but to make more money when it comes to bucking, when it comes to environmental protections. They, one of the the largest, greatest theft in the United States is actually wage theft that is committed by corporations day in and day out, every single year. And so it is inherently exploitative when you look at it, because it is about a small group of people who are trying to make the most money and trying to pull the most value from the workers who inherently actually make the value. And anybody who has the money to be able to invest, it's like, how do they get that money? And 9 times out of 10, if they are somebody that's already wealthy, it's because they inherited that wealth. And how did their ancestors get that wealth? Well, their ancestors got that wealth because they also exploited people in order to be able to get that wealth. And so, for instance, like the people who had a Wells Fargo, well, how did they get that wealth? Well, they got that wealth from my ancestors, right? And were exploited it. So therefore, capitalism is inherently exploitative. And the thing is, it's like, it is better than feudalism, but as in a progressive step. Now we have done with capitalism. Now we are to move on to the next step within our humanity, or, as far as we are on this planet. And it is not going to continue with capitalism. And it's not going to last for at least another, I give it maybe about another 100 years. And I'm being very kind in that, but it is going to phase out because we see the contradictions with it. And a lot of people are completely done with the contradictions because they're sick and tired of being sick and tired within the system that leaves them behind and keeps a small group of people at the top.
Wait, so let me, do you vote? Do you just, have you rejected voting? Have you rejected our democratic
Actually,
system?
no, I vote. Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's good. So that's good, right? So you're not sitting by the sidelines. You're trying to make things better in the here and now. And to your credit.
Well, here's the thing, right? I think it's more of I think it's more like a spectrum, not a spectrum. It's degrees, right? Yeah. Voting is only 2% of what we should be doing. This is why I do things like doing mutual aid on the ground, building dual power. I am part of a mutual aid group here in Orlando. I also volunteer and do work with other mutual aid groups in order to be able to build dual power within my local area. And I encourage mutual aid within my channel as well as on RBN in order for people to be able to do that, because we have to get workers together in order to be able to build a new system, because this system is really on its way out. We're in the late stages of capitalism. And so while I do vote, that is something that I spend maybe an hour or two on a Tuesday in November just to bubble in a few names. But ultimately, the real good that I can do is the more direct action I can do for my community. And this is what I encourage people to do, is by doing what they can for their neighbors, for the people around them. Because ultimately, I am actively doing more than what our politicians will do for the rest of us. And because you see it on the ground every single day in front of you. So that's just, it's like, yes, I'm not sitting on the ground on the sidelines, but I'm also not doing what's on the floor, which is doing that 2%, which is voting. I'm doing that and the 90% of what I should be doing.
Yeah, no, good for you and wonderful, right? And that's the answer, right? The answer isn't I do voting and nothing else. The answer is I do voting and a lot of other things. It's funny. I'm older and I, got married late. I spent a lot of time in coffee shops, and I would hear people my age complain about the youth and they had no ambition. And the reality was just the opposite, right? The youth had a ton of ambition. It was just ambition in a different direction. And so, from my standpoint, you're youth.
Yeah.
61. And
I want to say this. I do. Are you Gen X?
No, I'm last year of baby boom.
Oh, okay.
64.
I see a lot of ire that people have towards people who are the boomer generation. And I do not necessarily agree that we should paint an entire generation with a broad brush. And so when it comes to the ones who were fighting to push for something better, I do honor that. And I feel like it is up to us to pick up where they left off. And I look at the people like Fannie Lou Hamer. I look at the people like Franz Fanon. I look at the people like Malcolm X, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I look at the people like the James Farmers, and I look at the people like the Assata Shakurs. I look at them and I say, okay, so they did this. How do I pick this up? How do I take the baton and continue?
Yeah.
And so I think I look at those boomers and Fred Hampton. I look at those boomers and I go, okay, they set a course. How do I continue that course? And in that way, I don't paint the entire generation with a broad brush. I honor the boomers that came before me, that taught me, as well as a Gen X, because I know we have some Gen X's in the chat too. And because ultimately, there are some people who either had it right back then and taught us, or they may have been kind of shaky and then they developed and got right as they gotten older. And so I try to also take in the wisdom that I can glean from people like that as well. So I just want to say that I'm not one of those people who tries to paint an entire generation with a broad brush as well, because it's not fair to boomers, and it's not fair for boomers to do it to those of us who are younger. I'm an elder millennial, so so it's really on a case by case basis that I try to treat it.
Yeah. And that's good, right? Because all of this stuff is complex and shades of gray, right?
Oh, definitely.
We yearn for a binary world. The world is not binary. The world is complex and things change. And that's really my point, right? So, I formally joined the Democratic Party earlier this year. I'm now a minor official here in Ferguson. And what I'm trying to do is to get young people to re-engage with the Democratic Party, because not denying much of what you say and not denying that people of my generation had it really good and let it slip away. But the answer is we need to fix what we have. The answer is that we need to acknowledge that we did make these mistakes. We have created a situation where we've kind of returned to the golden age, right? The Gilded Age. But if you look at 1974, we had achieved more income distribution in our country than at any time in our history and probably at any time in the world. That's what we need to get back to. And we can do that. We can get back to one set of rules. We just haven't done it. Let me give you one example, right? In the United States of America, there are really only two kinds of people. There are living, breathing persons and legal persons. And legal persons are corporations. And the corporation was actually one of the great inventions of the modern world, because it allowed human beings to pool resources and do things like build a factory. But what has happened over time is that we have afforded more rights to legal persons, to corporations, than we afford to living, breathing persons. And the easiest example is if I were to send you $1,000, you as a living, breathing person, I've got to tell the IRS I sent you $1,000. Mm-hmm. If you form a corporation and I send you $1,000, I don't have to tell the IRS. So why do we require reporting of money to living, breathing persons, but not of legal persons? Mm-hmm. And it's just one example of thousands where we, without paying attention, people like myself, right? I'm as guilty as anybody else who's 61 years old, because I was aware of this stuff. I knew these things were happening. I wrote the occasional commentary. I didn't get in the trenches and keep it from happening. But that's the problem we have, right? Is we've allowed all of these second sets of rules to be slipped into our system, and it benefits a very narrow part of our population and benefits corporations. And so younger people don't have the same opportunities that we have. Mm-hmm. Just to give you one other example, right, of the impact of rules. In the several decades ago, an academic wrote a paper saying, hey, we should align CEO interests with shareholders' interests. Let's give CEOs options for stock. Mm-hmm. And Wall Street's like, oh my God, free money. And so Wall Street started churning out all of these options. And in the finance world, public companies, they have to file annual reports with the Securities and Exchange Commission. They have to file a profit and loss statement and a balance sheet. So when somebody gives you an option to buy stock, that's actually not a cash transaction. Mm-hmm. And so corporations started issuing all of these options to their senior executives without actually telling the shareholders they were doing that. Mm-hmm. Then there's something called the Financial Accounting Standards Board, FASB. FASB said, hey, this is wrong. We've got to put a dollar value on these options. Mm-hmm. And Wall Street's response, and I kid you not, was valuing things is really hard. We don't know how to do that. And so the compromise was they only had to do a line item on the annual report saying we gave out 1 million options. So for a period of 15 years, CEOs did not have to tell the shareholders how much money they were getting paid. In that 15-year period, CEO salaries went from give or take 13 times employer wages to 100, 200, 300 times employer wages.
Mm-hmm.
And during that time period, there was no 300% increase in return on equity or return on shareholder value. It was just because a second set of rules allowed a very tiny part of our population to gig the shareholders and get free money. And that's how we have the system we have today. And with a company called Enron, finally FASB put its foot down and they have to report now. But so again, it's another example. Pretty much anything bad you name, I could probably point to a second set of rules that was inserted in the system while people like myself stood by and let it happen. And I come back to the free market moderated by democracy still is the only real option. We just have to get back to the moderating part.
I disagree as far as the moderating part. However, I guess we'll have to agree to disagree on that one. But I do appreciate you coming on to have this discussion. And so hopefully there'll be more discussions and dialogue moving forward.
Well, and so next on my list is I'm going after Medicare for all. And I'd love to, when I get a few more of the things published, I'd love to have a conversation with you about that because Medicare for all is standing in the way of healthcare reform in the United States. And we need to... What's that?
Well, as far as Medicare for all, I think that Medicare for all is not good enough. I think we should have fully nationalized.
Okay. Well, that's it's funny you say that because when you look at the Medicare for all, they fudge the numbers in a really bad way. And it would likely be a disaster of a system. So in the health insurance world, right, we get our terms confused. What you're talking about is a single employer system, which they have in Great Britain. The doctors actually work for the government.
Mm-hmm.
And so Bernie proposed Medicare for all, which was a single payer system, but private care providers. They fudged the numbers. It would be an economic disaster. And it would get so bad that at some point we would have no choice but to force doctors to come to work for the government. So Bernie did not propose the system that you want, but he laid the groundwork for an economic disaster that could likely result in that system. So we'll have a healthy conversation about Medicare for all at some point. So I got some thoughts on that.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Ashby. Nice to have you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation. You're a really smart guy and an actual conversation, right? I appreciate that you actually listen to what I say. I listened to what you said. It's nice to actually have conversations again instead of just people calling me okay boomer and all sorts of curse words, via Twitter or TikTok or whatever else it is.
Yeah, Mama taught me better than that. All right.
Good for your mom and good for you.
All right. Thank you so very much. Take care.
Thank you so much for watching, and I appreciate it from the top and bottom of my heart. If you'd like to see any more, you can look here. 1. Forehead kisses.